In last week's episode, I showed some pretty amazing sailing conditions that I enjoyed during the first week. But in the second week, things changed, and it gave me a great opportunity to test out some of my heavy weather tactics. So sit back and enjoy the ride. Wave Rover is steering a course of southeast under jib alone, and she's making about 5 knots. Now, most self-steering has a hard time holding this course, but as you can see, my Mark III steering gear is doing a great job. Well, I'm currently in the middle of a gale with sustained winds of about 35 to 40 knots. And it all started late last night. But it's not a surprise because the barometer told us, about 24 hours ago that something was going to happen. It had fallen 5 millibars in about 12 hours. That and the clouds that started appearing on the horizon gave us a pretty good indication that weather was approaching. So last night, about 11 o'clock, the winds got to a point that I went forward and I put the first reef in the main. And that was pretty good for about half an hour. And then I put a second reef in the main, and I had to reef the jib at the same time to balance the boat. And that gave me about another half hour before conditions had worsened, and I felt as though it's time to drop the main entirely, and I ran under the reef jib for a considerable period of time, until about 3 in the morning. But at that point, the boat was just shuddering and shaking, and it was falling out of control, so it was time to do the next step, which was I pulled out about 200 feet of warp, and I released it from the quarters. So I tied it in a big loop. Warp is just rope. And I tied one end off to a cleat, strung it out, and tied the other end off to a spot on the other side of the boat. So with that, then the boat was manageable again. I had to change, of course, the the wind vane, because I had the large fair weather vane on to the small heavy weather vane. At the same time, I had to increase the lead counterweights. So one of the lessons there is you got to know where everything is on your boat, and you have to be able to get to it. So be organized. And part of that is take a look at the boat right now and see what it looks like in the middle of a gale. It really doesn't look much different than it does normally. That's my survival suit, which I had to wear last night because, surprisingly, I forgot to bring wet weather pants. So I had to wear the survival suit to stay dry, and it was pretty wet with the waves breaking over Wave Rover for most of the evolution. And secondly, you can just see my harness there with the green tether. I wore that for the first time. In fact, it was the first time I ever wore a harness with tether. I've never really felt conditions were quite as sloppy that I needed it, but I definitely did last night, no doubt about it. Then we have the galley, and no cooked meals today. The roll of toilet paper, in case you're curious, is just to help dampen the effect of the cooker going all the way to the top of the chart table. Then we continue on, starboard settee, and then we have the communication center with my Navionics charts, my InReach, that's the yellow communicator, the InReach communicator, Following the binoculars, easy access to my all-weather hatch, and the bilge pump, again easy access to the hatch. The E-perp and the fire extinguisher, and we're back to me. So what do you say we take a quick look now at what the weather looks like out through the starboard port. And the weather has mitigated considerably. It's probably now 30 knots. But more importantly, the seas have dropped down considerably. And we'll just let those drop down a little bit more, and then we'll get underway again. But there's no way we're going to be able to make any headway under these conditions right now. You can just see the warp trailing behind us. Oh my goodness. This is about 48 hours later after the gale, and the wind is freshened and back to the southeast, which unfortunately is the direction that we are trying to make. But I expect the wind to veer to the south or southwest at some point in the near future. So what I've done is I've hove to, and that's a method that allows Wave Rover to be in a comfortable tack while waiting for the wind to change, and at the same time she will hold her position more or less. Well, it's about 48 hours later, and indeed the wind has shifted. It's shifted now to the south, so I'm on a broad reach, and I came up on deck to find Wave Rover in the middle of a large pod of whales, and the whales are being escorted by an even larger group of dolphins. It's hard to tell in the video, but the whales on the outer edge of the pod are the largest. The whales that are approaching Wave Rover appear to be the smaller and perhaps more curious adolescent whales in the pod. I really feel blessed and honored to witness such a magnificent spectacle. Well, the wind is freshened once again, and it's blowing from the east, the direction that I'm trying to head. And again, I will have to hove to while I wait for the wind to veer to the south, or better still, the southwest. Join me next week for the last part of the Atlantic crossing, where my only jib is blown out and repairs must be made at sea. And finally, after 26 days, the westernmost part of Europe comes into view.